Forge, Idaho, greeted Dahlia Brightwood with a dusty wind and the smell of wormwood. She parked her tattered Ford at the town's only motel and sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the burned-out sign for Joe's. The last 15 hours of driving had worn her out, but the thought of finally leaving Seattle behind was energizing. The room smelled of lavender freshener and old sheets. Dahlia tossed her bag on the bed and walked to the window. The main street of the town was visible from start to finish. One-story houses, sparse passers-by, cars in the supermarket parking lot. Everything seemed so right, calm. Just what she'd been missing the last few years of her marriage to James. The divorce had been easier than she'd expected. Perhaps because by the time she caught her husband with the young intern in his office, their marriage had long since existed only on paper. James hadn't argued over the property. He'd had enough sense to admit his guilt. Her share of the sale of their shared house in Seattle should have been just enough to buy a small business here in Forge. The next morning, Dahlia met with the realtor, a gaunt woman named Martha Sims who seemed to know the history of every house in town. Garden of Eden was the name of this store under Mrs. Henderson, Martha told her as they walked down Main Street. She kept it for 40 years, until arthritis twisted her fingers so that she could no longer work with flowers. For the last 2 years, the store has stood closed. They stopped in front of a small one-story building with wide storefront windows. Behind the unwashed panes of glass, they could see empty racks and a counter. A greenhouse loomed behind the store, spacious, with partially broken glass, but still strong at its core. Sure, this place needs repairs. Martha waved a bunch of keys. But the price? I want to see inside, Dahlia interrupted her. The inside smelled of dust and stale air. Sunlight streaming through the dirty windows highlighted the dust specks dancing in the air. Dahlia walked slowly through the room, fingertips touching the old wooden shelves. The floor creaked in places, but it was sturdy. In the far corner, she spotted an ancient cash register, massive, brass, with round keys. The greenhouse is connected to the store through that door. Martha pointed to a glass door at the back of the room. The sprinkler system in there needs a complete replacement, but the frame is sturdy, Victorian built. They don't make those anymore. Dahlia nodded silently and headed toward the greenhouse. As soon as she opened the door, she had the strangest feeling of coming home after a long absence. Despite the desolation, there was still a special atmosphere here, humid, lively, full of possibilities. Shards of glass and dry leaves crunched underfoot. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, creating a bizarre pattern on the concrete floor. Dahlia looked up. The metal structures did indeed look solid despite their age. "I'm taking it," she said without turning back to the realtor. "But we haven't even discussed." "I'm taking it," Dahlia repeated firmly. "Let's do the paperwork." As she left the store, she took one last look at the faded Paradise Garden sign. Already tomorrow she would start a new life, and this time it would be different. For the first week, Dahlia worked without feeling tired. The store required a lot of attention. She cleaned the windows to a shine, scraped and varnished the old parquet, restored the antique cash register. A local carpenter restored the wooden shelving units, returning them to their original dark honey color. The greenhouse proved more difficult. Replacing broken glass and repairing the irrigation system had emptied her account almost to the bottom, but Dahlia didn't regret it. Every morning, she woke up at first light, looking forward to a new day's work. Little by little, the greenhouse came to life. The first tables for seedlings, special racks for orchids, and an automatic humidification system appeared. The day the first batch of flowers arrived, a stranger appeared at the door of the store. A tall woman with blonde hair gathered in a careless bundle. "You must be Dahlia," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Astrid Westcott, your cousin. Mom told me you were moving in." Dahlia remembered Astrid vaguely. They'd only seen each other a couple times as children at family reunions. The years had changed them both, but there was still something subtly familiar about Astrid's features. God, how many years has it been? 15? 20? Dahlia hugged her cousin. Astrid smelled of chalk and some kind of herbs. Enough for things to have changed. Astrid looked around. "I remember this store back under old Mrs. Henderson. My students would often run in here to get flowers for the teachers. I teach at the local school, she explained. They talked for several hours. Astrid talked about the town, about her work, about her detective husband who was often missing on duty. Dahlia listened, arranging the flowers in vases, and felt the feeling of loneliness that had haunted her for the past few months gradually disappear. The next day was the official opening of the store. Dahlia was nervous, but it didn't take long for the first customers to arrive. News of Paradise Gardens' revival quickly spread around town. "I need a bouquet for my wife." An elderly man in worn mechanic's overalls scrutinized the flowers. "We've had 40 years together." "What is she like?" Dahlia asked, already figuring out the arrangement. "I've been giving her roses all these years, but maybe it's time for a change?" Dahlia smiled and led him to a rack of orchids. Half an hour later, the man left with an exquisite arrangement of white phalaenopsis and fragrant peas, and Dahlia recorded the first sale in her new ledger. The day was filled with moments like this. A young girl buying the first cactus pot of her life. A young boy saving his pocket money for a bouquet for his mom for her birthday. An elderly lady choosing indoor plants for her collection. In the evening, closing the store, Dahlia noticed how the window had changed. Now it glowed from inside with a warm light, reflected in the polished glass. The streetlights were already on, and voices and laughter were coming from the pizzeria across the street. Slowly, she began to recognize the locals. Mrs. Fletcher, the librarian, passed by the store every morning on her way to work. Tom from the hardware store often stopped by with a cup of coffee and fresh gossip. High school students would gather at the window after school, looking at exotic plants. Astrid stopped by almost every day after class, sometimes staying to help with the flowers. From her, Dahlia learned the unspoken rules and traditions of the town, who to invite to barbecues and who to avoid. What topics should not be brought up in conversation, where it's best not to park in the rain. "You know," Astrid said one day while helping put together a bouquet for a local church, "it's like you've breathed new life into this place. Mrs. Henderson only sold roses and carnations, and you've got a whole botanical garden here." Dahlia remained silent, but a pleasant warmth spilled inside. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. The exotic plants she had high hopes for were already growing in the greenhouse. In the small apartment above the store, books and knickknacks gradually appeared, turning the empty space into a home. In the evenings, she often sat in the greenhouse, enjoying the silence and the humid air filled with the smell of earth and plants. Sometimes she thought she could hear the flowers growing, the quiet whisper of new life breaking through the soil. At such moments, the past seemed distant and unreal, like a story that had happened to someone else. One day, while filling out paperwork for a new shipment of plants, she came across an old photograph tucked behind a desk drawer. It showed Mrs. Henderson, very young, holding a bunch of roses. Dahlia stared at the picture for a long time, then set it in a frame on the counter. It seemed right to her to preserve this piece of the store's history. Gradually, the Garden of Eden became not just a store, but a place where people lingered to talk, to consult about plants, or just to be quiet among the flowers. Dahlia learned to distinguish who needed a bouquet and who just needed a kind word. Only sometimes, in the late evenings when the city was quiet and the ventilation system hummed, did Dahlia let herself think about what she'd left behind, about James's betrayal, about the sleepless nights, about the emptiness in their once shared home. But those thoughts didn't hurt now. They were part of history, like an old photograph of Mrs. Henderson, a past that helped her find her present. The invitation to the barbecue at the Thompsons came unexpectedly. Astrid dropped it off personally, explaining that it was a sort of tradition in their town to introduce newcomers to the local community. "It'll be fun," she assured Dahlia. "Plus, you'll finally get to meet Grant. He's rarely home, but he always comes to the Thompsons' barbecue." The Thompson house, a typical one-story ranch-style house, was buried in blooming hydrangeas. As Dahlia walked up the path to the porch, laughter and the clinking of glasses came from the open windows. In her hands, she carried an arrangement of exotic flowers, a gift for the lady of the house. Carol Thompson, an energetic woman with bright red hair, greeted her like an old acquaintance. "Oh dear, What a beauty. Come, I'll introduce you to everyone. The backyard was full of people. Smoke from the grill mingled with the scent of magnolia blossoms. Someone was playing a guitar softly. Dahlia spotted Astrid. She was standing by the drinks table, talking to a tall man in a light-colored shirt. "There's my sister." Astrid waved her hand. "Dahlia, meet Grant." Dahlia felt the attentive gaze of gray eyes on her. Grant Westcott was exactly as she'd imagined the detective to be, trim, with barely noticeable gray on his temples and the keen eye of a man accustomed to noticing details. "Heard about your store." His handshake was firm. "Astrid says you have an amazing collection of succulents." "You're interested in plants?" Dahlia was surprised. "Grant has a whole greenhouse on his veranda," Astrid interjected. "Only he's more into cacti." Throughout the evening, Dahlia had been furtively watching the Westcott couple. Something about their relationship seemed wrong. They stayed close, smiled, kept up conversation, but it was as if there was an invisible wall between them. Astrid often fell silent half-heartedly when her husband addressed her, and Grant seemed to avoid his wife's touch. "They got married right after college," Carol shared with her, noticing her interest. "Such a handsome couple they were, but detective work is a special life. Not every marriage can withstand that." Later that evening, Dahlia found herself in Grant's makeshift greenhouse. He was showing her his collection of rare cacti, and she was amazed at his knowledge. "This is Ariocarpus retususus." Grant gently turned a pot with a plant that looked like a gray rock. "Living rock, that's what they call it. In the wild, it's only found in Mexico." "Stunning." Dahlia leaned closer, scrutinizing the unusual texture of the plant. Their hands touched for a moment, and she felt goosebumps run down her skin. "You know," Grant was quiet, "sometimes I think plants are more honest than people. They don't pretend, they don't play a role. They just exist, following their nature." There was such bitterness in his voice that Dahlia involuntarily looked up. Their gazes met, and for a second she thought she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own loneliness. The evening ended late. As the guests departed, they thanked their hosts and exchanged reminiscences. Astrid and Grant were among the first to leave. He had an early shift. She thought of the evening, of the strange atmosphere in the Westcott household, of Grant's gaze when he spoke of plants, of the jasmine scent in the night air, of the dog barking in the distance. Something was stirring in her soul, a vague, uneasy feeling, like the foreboding of a thunderstorm. In the store, she turned on the lights in the greenhouse. Orchids cast bizarre shadows on the walls. Dahlia paused in front of a shelf of succulents, remembering Grant's enthusiastic voice explaining the particulars of caring for living stones. Suddenly, she felt uneasy. She hastily turned off the light and went upstairs to her apartment. But even as she fell asleep, she couldn't get rid of the memory of his eyes attentive, a little sad as if they held some secret. The next morning, Dahlia convinced herself that nothing special had happened. It was just an evening with new acquaintances, nothing more. But somewhere deep inside, she realized she was lying to herself. And 2 days later, Grant Westcott showed up at her store, holding a pot of withered cactus and a guilty smile. And something told Dahlia that this was only the beginning. September had been unusually warm. During the day, the sun heated the greenhouse windows so hot that they had to turn on additional ventilation, and in the evening the air was filled with the aroma of ripening apples from the neighbors' orchards. Grant began to appear at the store almost every day. At first, his visits seemed random. He needed advice on cactus care, a new pot, or a special potting mix. But gradually these visits became longer and the conversations deeper. "You know what always struck me about succulents?" he said one day while helping Dahlia transplant young plants. "Their ability to survive in the harshest conditions. They can go months without water and still stay alive. Sometimes I think humans should learn that resilience from them." Dahlia noticed that he had switched to "you," but didn't emphasize it. His hands, accustomed to handling crime scene evidence, were surprisingly gentle when touching the fragile plants. "And I'm fascinated by their diversity," she replied, trying not to think about how close he was standing. "Each adapts in its own way. Some store water in their leaves, some root deep into the ground. Like people," Grant looked up from the plant. "Everyone finds their own way of coping with life." There was the same bitterness in his voice as the evening of their first meeting. Dahlia felt an overwhelming urge to ask what was troubling him, but held back. Instead, she began to talk about the new shipment of plants she was expecting from Arizona. Sometimes he'd come in just to sit in the greenhouse after his shift. Didn't say a word, just sat among the flowers, as if trying to wash away the weight of what he'd seen during the day. At such times, Dahlia tried not to disturb him, minding her own business, but she could feel his presence all the time, as if the air in the greenhouse was becoming denser, more electrified. "You never talk about your work," she remarked one evening when they were closing up store together. "There are some things it's better not to talk about," he mused. "Especially out here, amidst all this beauty. It's like two different worlds there and here, and sometimes I wish I could stay in this one." Their gazes met, and Dahlia felt her heart begin to beat faster. His eyes seemed darker than usual in the semi-darkness of the store, and a tired crease lingered at the corners of his lips. "Grant," she began, but he shook his head. "Don't, please." Something had changed after that evening. Their conversations became more personal, their pauses more meaningful. Every casual touch sent a wave of goosebumps. Every glance seemed filled with unspoken words. Astrid began to drop by less often, citing busyness at school. When she did show up, the atmosphere in the store was tense. Dahlia caught her scrutinizing glances and felt a pang of guilt, even though nothing technically wrong was going on. One morning, Grant had brought her a rare specimen of Astrophytum asterias, a small, starfish-like cactus. "Found it from a fellow collector," he explained. "Thought it would look good in your collection." Dahlia took the pot gingerly, their fingers touching, and she felt a shiver run through her body. Grant didn't pull away, his hand lingering on her arm a little longer than necessary. "Thank you," her voice sounded hoarse. "He's beautiful." "So are you," he said quietly, and it was as if time had stopped. They stood in the middle of the store, surrounded by flowers and the morning sun, and the air between them seemed to tingle with tension. Dahlia knew she should pull back, say something light and insignificant, ruin the moment. But she couldn't. The front doorbell rang, causing them to jump away from each other. An elderly Mrs. Fletcher entered the store to pick up her weekly bouquet. Grant muttered something about urgent business and hurriedly left. All day, Dahlia couldn't concentrate on her work. She absent-mindedly made bouquets, mixed up orders, and nearly broke pots several times. In the evening, closing the store, she put the gift cactus in the most prominent place in the window. That night, she couldn't sleep for a long time. The wind rumbled outside the window, and the occasional car drove by in the distance, and she lay staring at the ceiling, thinking that something wrong and dangerous was happening, but she couldn't and wouldn't stop it. The next day, Grant came to the store again, and everything started all over again. The plant talk, the casual touches, the unspoken words and breathless stares. They both realized they were teetering on the edge of a precipice, but they continued this dangerous dance, unable to stop. Meanwhile, the first rumors began to appear in the town. Dahlia noticed how conversations were silenced when she entered the cafe, how the expressions on the neighbors' faces changed when she passed by. But even that couldn't make her stop these meetings that had become such an important part of her life. Every evening, closing the store, she looked at the gift cactus in the window and thought about the fact that some plants are really able to survive in the harshest conditions, except that humans are far less likely to do so. It was a Friday afternoon when the October sunset painted the greenhouse windows scarlet. Astrid had left for a teacher's conference in a neighboring state all weekend. Grant arrived later than usual when Dahlia was already closing up store. "Sorry for the late visit," his voice sounded hoarse. I needed to see you." It was sweltering in the greenhouse. The humid air, scented with the fragrance of blooming orchids, seemed to thicken around them. Dahlia could feel her heart beating frantically as Grant stepped closer. "I can't pretend anymore." He ran his fingers over her cheek, and she involuntarily gave in to the touch. "My marriage died a long time ago. Astrid and I have lived as neighbors for years. After the miscarriage, she just shut down. I tried. I really tried." Dahlia covered his lips in a kiss. Everything that had been held back for weeks came rushing out. His hand slid down her body, pulling her closer. She could feel his hot palms through the thin fabric of her blouse. Their breathing mingled, and the world around them ceased to exist. She didn't remember how they ended up on the old couch in the back room. His fingers trembled as he undid the buttons of her blouse. Her skin burned under his touch. Dahlia arched toward him as his lips touched her neck, traveled lower. The twilight of the greenhouse hid them from the world, only the rare glow of the sunset playing on their damp skin. Their closeness was like a storm, fierce, uncontrollable, sweeping away all barriers. The air was filled with quiet moans and the rustle of clothes. His hands were everywhere, exploring every curve of her body, giving pleasure that took her breath away. She responded with the same passion, forgetting shame and morality. When they finally became one, time stopped. There were only the two of them, their intertwined bodies, their shared breath, their movements in a rhythm as old as the world. Their orgasm came almost simultaneously, a bright flash of pleasure that made their eyes darken. Later, as the October night shrouded the greenhouse in cool darkness, they lay among the scattered clothes, and Dahlia listened to the pounding of his heart. "What will happen now?" she asked in a whisper. "I don't know," he kissed her temple. "But I can't lose you." Thus began their secret meetings. Late visits to the store, stolen kisses behind racks of flowers, rare but so precious hours of intimacy in the greenhouse. Each time Dahlia swore to herself it was the last time, and each time she realized she was lying. Grant talked about his marriage in snippets, as if every word hurt, about how he and Astrid had dreamed of having children, about the fifth-month miscarriage, about how his wife sank into depression, refusing help, about how they slowly drifted apart until they were strangers living under the same roof. "I should have left then," he said. "But she was so fragile. I was afraid she wouldn't make it on her own." Dahlia was silent, stroking his shoulders. She knew there was no excuse for what they were doing, that every encounter they had was a betrayal. But when he touched her, all thoughts of morality vanished. The city, meanwhile, went on with its life. Dahlia had learned to avoid prying eyes, to ignore the whispers behind her back. She immersed herself in her work, spending more and more time in the greenhouse, where every corner now held memories of their meetings. And at night, lying awake in her bed, she thought about how in every fairy tale the serpent tempter offers exactly what you need most, and that the Garden of Eden was not the right place to sin, but it was too late. November brought cold rains and heavy leaden clouds. Dahlia spent a lot of time in the greenhouse, where it was as warm and humid as the tropics. Grant came almost every evening after his shift. They made love on the old couch, talking about life or just being quiet, enjoying each other's closeness. "Tell me about your marriage," he asked one day as they lay covered by his jacket. Dahlia was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "You know, the weird thing is, I wasn't even really surprised when I caught James with that girl. It's like a part of me always knew it was going to happen. Our marriage was like a beautiful set. Everything perfect on the outside, but empty on the inside." She told him about the years she'd spent with James, about how they had gradually become strangers living under the same roof, about the endless corporate parties where she played the role of the perfect wife of a successful lawyer, about how she suffocated in that role. "When I found out about the affair, the first thing I felt was relief. There was finally a reason to end it all." Grant pulled her tighter against him and she could feel his heart beating. Their relationship grew deeper, going beyond mere physical attraction. They shared stories from the past, dreams, fears. Grant talked about difficult cases, Dahlia about her plans to expand her business. But their idyll was fragile. Astrid began showing up at the store at unexpected times, as if trying to catch them off guard. Her gaze changed, something cold, assessing in it. "Beautiful orchids," she said one day, looking at the new plants. "I wonder how long it takes for them to bloom. They say some species can wait years for the right moment." There was a hidden hint in her voice that sent a chill down Dahlia's spine. One morning, Dahlia spotted Astrid across the street, just standing there, staring at the store. She stood like that for almost an hour, as still as a statue, and then she left. After that incident, Dahlia began locking the back door of the store and installed additional lighting around the building. Grant noticed a change in his wife, too. "She's become different," he shared with Dahlia. "Almost doesn't sleep at night, sits in the dark for hours. And yesterday I found some strange photos on her phone, pictures of our house taken from the street." "Maybe we should stop?" Dahlia said the words, feeling her heart clench. "It's getting late." Grant pulled her to him. "I can't do this without you, and I don't want to." But the anxiety wouldn't let go. Dahlia began to notice small changes in the store. Pots rearranged, things moved. One day she found a picture of herself taken through the greenhouse window. The picture had been left on the counter. Things were changing in town, too. People were coming into the store less, and those who did come in were wary. Dahlia could hear the scraps of conversation that fell silent when she appeared. In the evenings, when Grant left, she stood at the window for long periods of time, staring out at the dark street. She thought she saw someone's shadow flickering between the trees. Fear slowly crawled into her soul, poisoning the happiness of their meetings. "It's going to be okay," Grant whispered, kissing her. But there was uncertainty in his voice. And then the anonymous calls began, the silence in the receiver, the heavy breathing, the occasional quiet laugh. Dahlia changed her number, but the calls continued. That night she had a dream. She was standing among her flowers, and they were slowly wilting, shedding petals like drops of blood. She woke up in a cold sweat and could not sleep for a long time, listening to the sounds outside the window. The premonition of trouble grew every day. It was like a storm cloud slowly creeping over the horizon. Dahlia knew the storm was inevitable. She just didn't know when the lightning would strike. December had been unusually cold. Dahlia kept raising the temperature in the greenhouse, trying to keep the delicate tropical plants from dying. Their meetings with Grant had become less frequent as the police began the hot season before the holidays. The first anonymous letter arrived at the beginning of the month, an envelope with no return address. Inside were photos of Dahlia and Grant in the greenhouse. On the back of each picture was written "Whore" in red marker. Dahlia burned the letter, but her hands shook for a few more hours. "What lovely orchids," Mrs. Fletcher said, going in for her weekly bouquet. "It's a pity they grow in such a dirty place." Her look was full of condemnation. The next letter contained a detailed description of their meetings, dates, times, details. The handwriting was altered, but Dahlia recognized the characteristic slant of the letters, the way Astrid wrote in greeting cards. Grant began to appear at the store only late at night when the streets were empty. Their meetings became desperate, as if both felt time was running out. "I'll file for divorce after Christmas," he said one day. "We'll move out of here. We'll start over." That night, December 23rd, the store closed earlier than usual. Dahlia was preparing the plants for the holidays when she heard the sound of the door opening. In the semi-darkness of the greenhouse, she saw a familiar silhouette. Grant? But it wasn't his gait, and not his perfume. In the twilight of the greenhouse, Dahlia saw Astrid, pale, with unaccustomedly disheveled hair. "We need to talk," Astrid's voice sounded hoarse. She moved between the rows of plants like a ghost. "Astrid, Shut up!" Astrid raised her hand sharply. "Just be quiet. You know, I've been trying to figure out why you? Why him? Why my husband and my sister decided to destroy my life?" Dahlia crept toward the back of the greenhouse, where barrels of diluted fertilizer stood. The heavy smell of organics mingled with the scent of flowers, creating a nauseating bouquet. "We didn't mean to hurt you." Dahlia could feel her voice shaking. "Hurt?" Astrid laughed, and that laugh made Dahlia's hair stand up. "Do you know what real pain is? It's when your baby dies inside you, when you wake up in the night and can't breathe from grief, when your only loved one betrays you with your own blood." It all happened swiftly. Dahlia didn't have time to react as Astrid rushed forward. A hard jolt, and she lost her balance. As she fell, she saw Astrid's face contorted with rage, smelled the sickening odor of fertilizer, and then her head sank into the dark slurry. The thick liquid burned her lungs with its icy grip. Dahlia tried to get out, but Astrid held on tight, pushing her head deeper and deeper into the stinking mass. Her hands clung helplessly to the edges of the barrel, her feet slammed convulsively against the metal walls. The desperate struggle gradually subsided, and her movements became weaker and weaker. The nauseating smell of death, a mixture of rotting organics, chemicals, and decomposition, wafted around. The last thing Dahlia felt was that vile stench filling her lungs along with liquid death. Astrid didn't let go of the lifeless body until several minutes later. Her hands were smeared in the same black sludge that had filled Dahlia's lungs. Methodically wiping her hands, she opened several bottles of fertilizer, setting them next to the barrel. From the outside, it must have looked like an accident. The shopkeeper had fainted from the poisonous fumes and fallen into the barrel of diluted manure. As she left the greenhouse, Astrid took one last look at her feet in garden boots sticking out of the barrel. There was a heavy smell of death in the air, mixed with the scent of orchids. She locked the door and disappeared into the December night, leaving only a trail of footprints in the freshly fallen snow. The body was discovered on the morning of December 24th. Mrs. Fletcher, passing the store, noticed a strange light in the greenhouse and called the police. Grant Westcott was dismissed from the case at once. He was an acquaintance of the deceased. The investigation was assigned to detectives Hutch Redmond and Blair Kincaid. The picture of the incident seemed very clear. Several open bottles of concentrated fertilizer were found in the greenhouse. Apparently, Dahlia had been preparing a solution for her exotic plants that required special care before the holidays. Typical accident, the medical examiner stated. Mixing these fertilizers releases toxic fumes. She lost consciousness and fell into a barrel of solution. Her lungs filled with liquid, classic drowning. Blair Kincaid was looking around the greenhouse. Everything seemed logical. Gloves on the table, a special journal with notes on plant care, a measuring cup next to the barrel. Probably in a hurry to finish before Christmas, she suggested. Decided to work in the evening. Interviews with witnesses confirmed this version. Neighbors saw lights in the greenhouse at about 9 p.m. Mrs. Fletcher said that Dahlia often stayed out late, especially when she was tending to her orchids. She was very responsible, the older woman sighed. Always said plants needed constant attention, especially in the winter. Astrid Westcott kept her cool during the interview. Yes, she had seen her cousin the previous afternoon, had stopped by to buy a Christmas wreath. No, she didn't notice anything unusual. Dahlia was preoccupied with work, preparing for the holiday week. Technical experts confirmed that the concentration of vapors from mixed fertilizers in the closed greenhouse could quickly reach dangerous levels. At the same time, the victim himself may not have noticed the threat. One of the components dulled the sense of smell. By evening, Redmond closed the folder with the preliminary report. Everything pointed to an accident, a tragic coincidence on Christmas Eve. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, he told his partner. File the paperwork to close the case. The medical examiner's report was unequivocal. Accidental poisoning from chemical fertilizer fumes followed by drowning. No signs of violent death were found. Detective Redmond personally put the last signature on the documents on December 27th, holding his eyes on the photo of the deceased in the case, such a young, beautiful woman, and such a ridiculous death on Christmas Eve. On that same frosty December day, the funeral was held. The whole town came to say goodbye to the owner of the Garden of Eden. The coffin was buried in white orchids, Dahlia's favorite flowers. Grant stood beside his wife, pale and devastated, not uttering a word during the entire ceremony. Astrid stood straight as a string, clutching a black umbrella in her hands, though it had long since stopped snowing. She supported her husband under his arm, the model of a grieving relative. Mrs. Fletcher wept as she remembered how Dahlia always found the freshest flowers for her. Carol Thompson brought a Christmas wreath, the same one Dahlia had made for her home shortly before her death. Even the surly butcher from the store across the street came with a bouquet of wildflowers, out of place in December. After the funeral, life in the town gradually returned to normal. The window of the Garden of Eden was draped with black cloth. The town council debated the fate of the store. The building was too valuable to sit empty in the center of town. There was talk that the Thompson family would buy the business. Their youngest daughter had a degree in floristry and big plans for the future. Grant went back to work. diving headfirst into the investigations. He was hardly ever home, staying late at the station. Astrid continued to teach school, still as organized and neat. Only at home, in the evenings, she began to drink more and more often. On the evening of December 30th, Grant returned from duty earlier than usual. He found Astrid in the kitchen with an almost empty bottle of red wine in front of her and some papers burning in the fireplace. "What are you burning?" he asked, taking off his coat. "Old letters." Astrid tossed another envelope into the fire. Sorting things out, Grant poured himself some coffee and sat down across from his wife. It was the first time they'd been alone together in days. He usually came in when she was already asleep. "City Hall called today," he said, looking into his cup. "They asked about the store. We need to decide what to do with it. As next of kin." "Ah, so that's what's bothering you," Astrid interrupted him, pouring herself another glass. "The store. Of course, we have to save our favorite place." There was such bitterness in her voice that Grant looked up. "I just think a decision has to be made," he said cautiously. "The Thompsons have been interested in buying. Sarah has experience." "The Thompsons?" Astrid turned around abruptly, sputtering her wine. "Of course, let's sell it. Wipe out the last memory of a dear cousin. Let sweet Sarah make her own arrangements there. I'm sure she won't be staying out late with married men." Grant froze with his cup halfway to his mouth. There was something new in Astrid's voice. Angry, venomous. "What are you talking about?" "About your precious Dahlia." Astrid grabbed the bottle as if it were a straw she was holding on to. "You think I didn't know? Didn't see the way you looked at her? How you ran to that damn greenhouse on the pretense of consulting on cacti? How you'd linger there for hours on end?" "Astrid." "No, now you shut up." She took a big gulp straight from the neck. "You know what's really funny? Everyone thinks she's so responsible, so dedicated. Poor Dahlia, taking so much care of her flowers. So careful that she didn't notice the dangerous fumes. What monstrous nonsense." "What are you trying to say?" Grant set the cup down slowly. "I'm talking about justice." Astrid laughed hysterically. Her face contorted, becoming almost unrecognizable. "She got what she deserved. That bitch dared to have an affair with my husband in my town. Did she think I wouldn't recognize? Wouldn't notice? And now she's fertilizing her favorite orchids. Poetic, isn't it?" Grant felt a chill run down his spine. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, he pulled out his phone. "What are you doing?" Astrid staggered over, leaning against the desk. "Calling Detective Redmond." His voice sounded deadpan. "I think he'll be interested to hear about this accident." "Call!" She laughed again, and that laugh was scarier than a scream. "Do you think they'll believe you? A husband who cheated on his wife with her sister? You have no proof. There's nothing. And I finally got my revenge. For everything. For our marriage. For our child. For all these years." She faltered, noticing the look on his face. Grant silently pressed the stop button on the recorder on his phone. The only sounds in the silence were the crackling of the letters burning in the fireplace and Astrid's heavy breathing. Outside the window, snow was beginning to fall, the same snow that had fallen the night Dahlia Brightwood's life had ended. That night, after his wife's confession, Grant sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the phone in his hand. Astrid continued to say something, waving the bottle, but he could no longer hear her words. One thought pounded in his head. Dahlia wasn't just dead, she'd been murdered, and killed by the woman now swaying drunkenly in front of him. With trembling fingers, he pressed the call button. Redmond answered after the third beep, apparently still awake despite the late hour. "Detective Redmond? This is Grant Westcott. I apologize for the late call, but I've got something important. It's about the death of Dahlia Brightwood." He heard something rustle on the other end of the wire, as if Redmond had straightened up in his chair. "I'm listening to you." "I have a recording, a confession. It wasn't an accident." There was a brief pause. "Stay where you are. We're on our way out." Astrid seemed only now to realize the gravity of the situation. She tried to snatch the phone from her husband, but he pushed her hand away. "What have you done?" Her voice sounded no longer drunk, but frightened. "They won't believe it. It was all the wine. I didn't realize what I was saying." Redmond and Kincaid arrived 20 minutes later. They listened to the tape in silence while Astrid sat in a chair with her arms wrapped around herself. "Mrs. Westcott, you should come with us," Kincaid said. "We'll have a lot of questions." By morning, all the necessary warrants had been obtained. Dahlia's body was exhumed the next day. The town was still asleep when cemetery workers began digging a fresh grave. A second autopsy was conducted by a different team of experts. What had been missed in the pre-holiday rush was now obvious. The characteristic bruises on her neck and shoulders, the mark of heavy pressure on the back of her head, the scratches on her hands, signs of a desperate struggle for life. "She fought back," the new examiner said, showing Redmond the photographs. "See these bruises? Someone was holding her underwater, strong hands, but judging by the size of the prints, female." They found new evidence in the greenhouse, too. Forensics found Astrid's clear fingerprints on the fertilizer bottles, the same ones that the original theory was that Dahlia herself had opened. "She wore gloves when she worked with the fertilizer," Blair Kincaid remarked, looking through old photos of the scene. "Always. It's in the plant care log. Then why are Astrid's prints on the vials?" Grant had spent nearly 24 hours at the station, telling everything he knew. About his relationship with Dahlia, about his wife's strange behavior in recent weeks, about how she'd been watching the store. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Redmond asked. "Because I love them both," Grant replied. "And I didn't want to believe Astrid was capable of such a thing." The arrest warrant was issued 3 days later. When they came for Astrid, she was sitting in her classroom checking her notebooks. She didn't resist, just asked for a moment to gather her things. And she smiled, the same cold smile she'd stood with at the funeral. "You know," she said to Redmond as he snapped on the handcuffs, "the greenhouse smelled so good with orchids that night. Almost like it smells like spring now." The news of Astrid Westcott's arrest shook the city. People gathered in groups on the streets, discussing the details of the case. Some recalled her strange behavior at the funeral. Others shook their heads in disbelief that the quiet teacher was capable of murder. The Garden of Eden never opened. No one wanted to buy a place with such a reputation. Grant resigned and left town. Word was he sold the house and moved somewhere on the West Coast. And in the abandoned greenhouse, the white orchids still bloomed, the same orchids that Dahlia loved so much. They reached for the sun through the dusty glass, indifferent to human passions and tragedies. At her trial, Astrid was found guilty of first-degree murder. She did not repent or ask for forgiveness, only said in her last words, "Sometimes love kills, and sometimes it's fair." Detective Redmond often thought about this case, about how thin the line between love and hate is, how easy it is to overlook the obvious if you don't want to see the truth, and how even in the Garden of Eden, there can be a serpent lurking. Dahlia Brightwood's case was closed in the spring. By then, the snow had long since melted, and the first flowers were blooming in the front gardens, but people still long avoided the abandoned store, where the last orchids slowly wilted behind the dusty windows.